The winter of 1941 to 42 never arrived. It fell upon the front like a death sentence. After the failed attempt to take Moscow, the German army was no longer the unstoppable machine that had crushed half of Europe. Now, they were exhausted, with supplies stretched to the limit, scattered across thousands of kilometers of hostile territory. And then came the cold. It wasn't an ordinary cold spell. It was the kind of cold that tears at your skin, that freezes the air inside your lungs, that turns every breath into pain. Thermometers plummeted to brutal levels, temperatures so low that the steel of the weapons began to fail. Machine guns jammed mid-combat. Engine oil turned into a thick paste. Trucks simply stopped working, abandoned in the snow like dead carcasses. The German soldiers, still dressed in uniforms inadequate for that icy hell, improvised as best they could. They wrapped cloths, pieces of blankets, anything they could find, but it wasn't enough. Fingers darkened, then stiffened, and then simply died. Gangrene began silently and ended in amputations or death. But the cold wasn't the only enemy. From the white shadows of the frozen landscape, the Red Army began to move. Strengthened by the winter they knew like no other, the Soviets launched a massive counterattack. Skiers appeared out of nowhere. Troops camouflaged in white blended into the snow, invisible until the moment of attack. Tanks advanced with difficulty, but with determination, carving a path through the ice like steel monsters. For the Germans, it was like fighting ghosts. Lines of defense were beginning to give way. Soldiers disappeared into the deep snow, swallowed by the terrain or by death. Wounded soldiers who fell to the ground often didn't cry out for long. The cold quickly silenced everything. And then came the brutal realization. They weren't just fighting against an army. They were fighting against winter itself. An invisible, merciless enemy that could not be defeated. With bullets, each night was a battle for survival. Each dawn, a surprise. Who would still be alive? Who had frozen during the night? The Eastern Front had ceased to be merely a battlefield. Now it was a white cemetery, where the ice decided who would live and who would die. The little town of Kholm, worthless, or everything. On the vast map of the Eastern Front, where millions of men clashed in colossal battles, the small town of Kholm barely appeared. Lost among dense forests, frozen rivers, and precarious roads, it was, at first glance, just another insignificant point in the Russian countryside. A place that, in times of peace, would hardly arouse interest. A cluster of simple houses, a church, a few administrative buildings, and a population accustomed to isolation and the harshness of winter. But war has the power to transform the insignificant into the vital. Kholm was located in a delicate strategic position. It functioned as a communications and supply hub, connecting different sectors of the German forces advancing or attempting to resist in that region. Roads and routes passed through it, allowing the flow of troops, ammunition, and orders, in a scenario where every supply line was a matter of life or death. Losing Kholm meant opening a dangerous breach in the already fragile German logistics system, and that is exactly what the Soviet command realized. Following the counterattack that began in the winter of 1941, the Red Army began to advance with a clear objective: to break through German lines, isolate units, and destroy pockets of resistance one by one. It was no longer just about pushing the enemy back. It was about encircling, crushing, and eliminating. Kholm, with its strategic location, became a perfect target. For the Germans, the city quickly ceased to be merely a transit point. It came to be seen as an anchor, a point that needed to be held at all costs to prevent the complete collapse of the region. And so, orders began to arrive. Strengthen positions, prepare defenses, transform every building into a potential bastion. Soldiers began digging trenches in the frozen ground, a brutal task. The earth, hardened by the cold, was almost as resistant as stone. Pickaxes struck the icy ground with a dry, desperate sound. Every meter dug cost sweat, energy, and time, a resource that was running out. Barricades were erected with whatever was available. Wood torn from houses, destroyed furniture, abandoned carts. Sandbags froze and hardened, forming makeshift walls. Windows became firing points. Churches were transformed into observation posts. Dark basements became shelters against artillery fire. The city was slowly beginning to transform into a fortress. But there was a problem that few dared to admit aloud. Kholm had not been designed to withstand a siege. There weren't enough food supplies to last for weeks, much less months. Ammunition was limited. Medical resources were scarce. And the winter made everything even more cruel. Every preparation seemed insufficient in the face of what was to come. Meanwhile, on the Soviet side, the plan advanced with ruthless precision. Troops moved around the city, closing in like a patient predator. Roads were cut. Communication lines were severed. Isolation began to take shape, almost imperceptible at first, but inevitable. Inside Kholm, tension was rising. The soldiers sensed something was wrong. Patrols reported enemy movements getting closer and closer. The distant sound of artillery echoed like a constant warning. The encirclement wasn't complete yet, but it was closing in. And at that moment, a silent truth began to take root among men. That small town, previously ignored by everyone, was about to become the center of a desperate struggle for survival. Kholm was no longer irrelevant. She had become everything. The siege begins. What was once just a suspicion was now becoming reality. The net was closing in. The last access routes to Kholm began to disappear one by one. Roads that once allowed supplies to reach the city were now under enemy fire or simply occupied by Soviet troops. Messengers sent out of the city did not return. Convoys disappeared into the snow, swallowed by the white silence or destroyed before even reaching their destination. Within the city, the feeling of isolation began to become suffocating. Approximately 5,500 men, German soldiers, auxiliary units, and Allied forces were now trapped inside Kholm. They came from different backgrounds, some experienced, others worn down by previous campaigns. But they all shared the same fate. They were surrounded, no escape. Outside, the Red Army closed the ring with brutal precision. Troops positioned themselves at strategic points around the city, forming an almost continuous line of siege. Artillery was positioned in elevated and hidden locations, ready to bombard any attempt at resistance. Infantry units advanced cautiously, testing the defenses, searching for weaknesses. There was no rush. The Soviets knew that time was on their side. Inside Kholm, every decision was now a matter of immediate survival. German officers hastily reorganized their forces. Defensive sectors were defined. Every street, every intersection, every building was assigned a purpose. There was no longer a rear guard. The entire city was the front line. The soldiers began to understand the gravity of the situation. They were no longer fighting to move forward. They were fighting to avoid being wiped off the map. The first attacks came as tests. Quick probes, limited assaults. Small Soviet groups advanced under cover of snow and darkness, trying to gauge the German reaction. Gunfire echoed in the frozen night. Grenades exploded between houses. Alarms were hastily sounded. Men awoke with a start, grabbing their weapons with fingers stiff from the cold. And then came the moments of silence. A heavy, almost unbearable silence. The kind of silence that made each soldier hear their own heart beating. No one relaxed. No one trusted in the calm, because everyone knew the next attack could come at any moment. With each passing hour, the siege became more solid. Attempts to communicate with higher command were becoming increasingly difficult. Messages, when they did get through, took too long, and the responses were scarce. Reality was beginning to impose itself cruelly. They were on their own. Stockpiles began to be counted more carefully. Ammunition, food, medicine, everything was now precious. Nothing could be wasted. Every bullet needed to find a target. Every piece of bread needed to be divided. Meanwhile, outside, the enemy was growing. More Soviet troops arrived, more weapons, more pressure. The ring was closed. Kholm had become an isolated pocket, surrounded on all sides, an island of resistance in the middle of an enemy ocean. And in that moment, between the biting cold and the distant echo of artillery, a brutal truth became impossible to ignore. They didn't know when or if anyone would come to rescue them. The siege was not just military. It was psychological. It was the beginning of a slow and relentless struggle against time, the cold and death, which drew closer each day. The order: resist until the last man. When the confirmation arrived, it didn't bring hope. It brought weight. The message from the German High Command was short, direct, and relentless. Kholm had to be held at all costs. There was no mention of withdrawal. There was no evacuation plan. There was no clear promise of immediate rescue. Just a cold, almost mechanical order to resist. For the men inside the city, this meant one thing. They had been transformed into a living fortress. And fortresses do not retreat. The officers gathered their troops and delivered the order. Some spoke firmly, trying to maintain discipline and morale. Others, more experienced, knew exactly what it meant, even without saying it aloud. It was a sentence disguised as strategy. Still, there was no choice. The German war machine depended on absolute obedience. And in Kholm, every man was now part of an invisible line that could not be broken. If that position fell, it would open the way for even deeper Soviet advances, threatening other already weakened sectors. So, the decision had been made. Kholm would not only be defended, it would be transformed into a frozen fortress. Every inch of the city was prepared for death. Buildings were reinforced, firing positions adjusted, fields of vision calculated. Snipers were positioned at strategic points, observing narrow streets and possible access points. Machine guns were mounted in locations where they could sweep away the enemy with brutal efficiency. There was no more room for error. Engineers improvised defenses with what was left: wood, iron, debris. Mines were placed along possible advance routes. Communication wires were buried in the snow, attempting to ensure some control between the defense sectors. The men worked without stopping. They dug, carried, assembled, and reinforced, and all this in an unforgiving cold. The frozen ground resisted every blow of the tool. Hands bled inside the stiff gloves. Breath escaped in dense clouds, as if each man was slowly dissolving into the icy air. But the worst part wasn't the physical work. That was what came next. As night fell and silence reigned, the order echoed in the mind of every soldier: resist to the last man. Some tried not to think about it. They focused on tasks, on routine, on the next patrol, on the next watch shift. Others faced reality head-on, with a kind of heavy, almost silent resignation. They knew they were surrounded. They knew that supplies were limited. They knew that winter would not let up. And above all, they knew that this order meant there was no guarantee of survival. Outside, the Red Army continued to prepare. The siege became more organized, more structured. It wasn't just constant pressure. It was a calculated, methodical tightening, like a hand slowly closing. Inside Kholm, the transformation was complete. The city was no longer just a point on the map. It was a besieged fortress, a place where every window could shoot death, where every corner could be the end, where each man carried not only his weapon, but the weight of an order that allowed no failure. And so, amidst the ice and the silence, Kholm prepared for the inevitable. The storm had not yet reached its peak, but she was coming. The white hell. The cold has ceased to be a minor detail, and has become the most constant enemy within Kholm. There was no rest. There was no real shelter. There was no way to escape. Temperatures plummeted to almost unimaginable levels. 40 degrees below zero, sometimes lower. The air felt like it was cutting through the face like invisible blades. Taking a deep breath was a painful mistake. The simple act of inhaling burned from the key inside, as if the lungs were being slowly frozen. The men learned quickly. Winter was unforgiving of distractions. Weapons began malfunctioning with alarming frequency. Machine guns jammed at the most critical moment. Bolts froze. Soldiers had to constantly disassemble and clean their weapons, often with their bare hands, even knowing that this could cost them chunks of skin torn off by the icy metal. The equipment, like the men, was being consumed by the cold. Engines wouldn't start. Radios malfunctioned. Rigid cables broke easily. Everything that depended on mechanical operation seemed to fight against its own nature to continue functioning. But nothing was as devastating as the impact on the human body. The first signs were subtle. Numb fingers, tingling, a slight loss of sensation. Then came the dark spots. The skin hardened, died. Frostbite. Soldiers tried to hide their symptoms. No one wanted to be removed from their position. No one wanted to appear weak. But the cold didn't care about courage. Frozen feet inside boots. Useless hands. Noses and ears that simply ceased to exist. Consumed by gangrene. Some men were evacuated to makeshift shelters. Others simply continued fighting until they could no longer hold a weapon. And then there were the wounded. Being hit in combat was already a terrible sentence. But in Kholm, in winter, it was almost always a death sentence. Blood froze quickly. Open wounds hardened. Without proper medicine, without warmth, without the means to treat the wounds, many simply did not survive. Some died in silence. Others screamed until they couldn't anymore. The snow surrounding the city, once white and silent, began to change. Dark patches spread. Bodies lay where they fell, often impossible to recover immediately. The ice preserved everything, transforming the battlefield into a frozen scene of horror. But the cold didn't just affect the body. He attacked the mind. Fatigue was constant. Sleeping was dangerous. Many men who closed, their eyes never woke up again. Exhaustion accumulated, and with it came confusion, sluggishness, silent despair. Each night was a test of endurance. Each sunrise was a victory, however small. Meanwhile, outside, the Red Army continued to press on. Accustomed to that brutal climate, the Soviets seemed to move with more ease, using the winter as an ally. Troops equipped with appropriate clothing advanced through the snow more efficiently, while the Germans fought not only against the enemy, but against the environment itself. Inside Kholm, the reality was becoming increasingly clear. They weren't just surrounded. They were being slowly consumed because of the cold, because of the famine that was beginning to emerge, due to physical and mental exhaustion. Winter had transformed the city into something more than a battlefield. It had become a white hell, where surviving even one more day was an extraordinary feat. And the worst was yet to come. The first Soviet wave. The silence ended, brutally, without clear warning, without sufficient preparation for what was to come. The first major wave of Soviet attack fell on Kholm like an avalanche of steel, fire, and men. In the beginning, there was the sound. A distant thunderclap grew rapidly. The roar of artillery. In seconds, the sky above the city transformed into a spectacle of destruction. Grenades began to fall with increasing precision, exploding between houses, raising columns of snow, frozen earth, and debris. The impact shook the ground, rattled already fragile walls, and made the air vibrate as if the world itself were breaking apart. Within the German positions, there was no time to think, just react. The men huddled in makeshift shelters, pressing their bodies against the icy ground as artillery battered every sector of the city. Shrapnel ripped through wooden walls like paper. Roofs collapsed. Entire structures were reduced to rubble in a matter of seconds. And then came the infantry. From the outer lines of the siege, Red Army troops emerged, advancing through the deep snow. Dressed in white winter uniforms, many were almost invisible against the terrain. They moved in waves, determined, driven not only by orders, but by the very brutality of the war they were waging. The Germans opened fire. Machine guns began spitting out continuous bursts, cutting through the frigid air. The sound was dry, repetitive, almost mechanical. a desperate attempt to contain the relentlessly advancing mass of humanity. Rifles fired in quick succession. Every shot had to count. The snow began to stain, but the Soviets didn't stop. Some fell, others advanced over them. The distance decreased rapidly. Shouts echoed across the battlefield. Orders, warnings, despair. Grenades were thrown. Explosions tore through the space between the two sides, hurling bodies and snow into the air. Within minutes, the battle was no longer a distant prospect. It was nearby, brutal, inevitable. The first Soviet soldiers reached the outer lines of defense. Shallow trenches, makeshift barricades, everything began to be tested under real pressure. Direct combat began to emerge in isolated spots. Point-blank shots, bayonets being used amidst the chaos. The enemy was no longer a distant silhouette. It was a man in front of you. Within Kholm, each sector fought on its own. Communication was faulty and fragmented. Officers shouted orders, trying to maintain some form of control, but the noise was deafening. The smell of gunpowder mingled with the freezing air. Smoke rose slowly, carried by the icy wind among the rubble. And even so, the Germans resisted. Each position defended was a momentary victory. Each contained Soviet advance was a breath of fresh air. But the cost was high. Men fell, injuries piled up, and the attrition began to show. The first wave was not just an attack. It was a test, a brutal test, to measure the resilience of that makeshift fortress. And at the end of that first major confrontation, one thing became clear to everyone involved. Kholm wouldn't fall easily, but she wouldn't come out unscathed either. The blood had already been spilled on the snow, and that was just the beginning. House-to-house combat. After the first wave, the war in Kholm changed shape, as if the very air had contracted, suffocating the entire city in an embrace of iron and ice. It was no longer a battle of lines drawn on crumpled maps, of large troop movements or artillery thundering in the distance. Now, it was a fragmented, visceral, suffocating fight to the last breath, fought meter by meter, within the very flesh of the city, where every brick, every plank, every shadow carried the weight of imminent death. The enemy was already inside, not in the distant hills, not behind faraway trenches, but there, breathing the same frozen air, treading the same steps that creaked under boots soaked in blood and melted snow. The narrow streets, once silent and covered by a white mantle that seemed like an innocent shroud, had transformed into corridors of death, labyrinths where the wind howled like an eternal lament, and every corner hid an abyss of terror. Every door could open to an armed enemy on the other side, the barrel of a rifle glinting for a fraction of a second before spitting hot lead. There were no longer any defined fronts. The fighting was everywhere at once, like a poison spreading through the city's veins. It was close-quarters warfare, pure survival warfare, where the distance between life and death was measured in centimeters, not kilometers. Red Army soldiers, their eyes bloodshot with fury and hunger, infiltrated the rubble like starving ghosts, using explosion craters as temporary graves, destroyed walls as makeshift shields, and partially collapsed houses as hunting tunnels. They advanced in small groups, silent when fear made them cunning, explosive when rage propelled them forward, grenades thrown blindly, shots that echoed like hammer blows to the skull. The Germans, cornered and exhausted, responded in the only way possible in a city that had become their living tomb, holding each position to the limit of human endurance, to the point where their fingers trembled not from cold, but from sheer terror. Entire houses were transformed into makeshift fortresses, veritable traps of stone and wood. Holes were opened in the interior walls with bayonets and rusty shovels, allowing men to move from room to room without exposing their bodies to the treacherous streets. A single building could house a dozen condemned souls, each covering a different angle, eyes glued to cracked sights, hearts pounding against ribs that seemed about to burst. They waited for the right moment to shoot, But the right moment never came. Only the inevitable, the sudden, the terrifying. And when contact did happen, it was brutal, inhuman, a direct plunge into the abyss of the soul. There was no safe distance, no honor, no glory. Shots were fired from meters away, the flash of gunpowder illuminating faces contorted with hatred and terror for a fraction of a second that seemed eternal. Grenades were thrown through broken windows, exploding inside closed rooms like fists of fire that tore through the air. Cracked walls hurled splinters of wood and human bones against the rubble. The impact was devastating. Bodies were hurled like rag dolls, blood splattering in grotesque patterns on the shattered plaster, the smell of burnt flesh mixing with the stench of gunpowder and the urine of fear. Men screamed not from pain but from pure despair, hoarse voices breaking in the icy air like trampled glass. When ammunition ran out, and it always did too soon at the worst possible moments, all that remained was hand-to-hand combat, the most primitive and terrifying of all. Bayonets were driven in with desperate force, blades sinking into soft bellies, ribs cracking like dry branches. Bodies clashed in tight spaces, elbows, knees, teeth tearing skin, nails, piercing eyes. Screams echoed inside destroyed houses, mixed with the dry sound of rifle butts, the gurgling of cut throats, the dull thud of skulls smashed against rotten wooden floors. It was quick, violent, and often silent after it was over, leaving only the agonizing gasp of a dying man and the slow dripping of blood in the silence that followed. The city began to split into small, isolated hells, as if Kholm's own map had been torn apart by invisible hands. One block might be under German control, with machine guns spewing death from fortified windows, while the next was already in Soviet hands, where makeshift red flags fluttered above piles of corpses. Sometimes, the same building was contested floor by floor, like a macabre game of human chess. The ground floor occupied on one side with barricades of broken furniture and sandbags. The upper floor on the other, where grenades rolled down the stairs like dice of fate. It was a labyrinth of death, where the echo of footsteps upstairs could mean the end of everything. And in the midst of it all, there was the cold, always present, always attacking, a crueler enemy than any man. Men fought with numb fingers, swollen and black with frostbite, with muscles as stiff as old ropes, with heavy breathing escaping in clouds that betrayed their position. Each movement required more effort than the last. Each mistake cost not only life but dignity. A stumble in the dark, a sigh too loud, and the enemy bayonet found its mark on their throat. The wounded rarely managed to escape. Falling inside a contested house was, more often than not, the end. A slow, agonizing end, where blood froze in open wounds while combat raged around like a storm. Makeshift medics, with trembling hands and eyes glazed with exhaustion, tried the impossible, tying tourniquets with strips of torn uniform, injecting morphine that barely relieved the excruciating pain. But everything was lacking. Light to see the veins, heat to prevent shock, equipment to stop the bleeding. Many were left behind, amidst the chaos, whimpering softly as boots sped past and bullets buzzed like furious wasps. Communication practically disappeared, swallowed by the noise and panic. Orders were given in hoarse shouts or simply didn't arrive, lost in the howling wind and rubble. Each group fought with what they had, a handful of bullets, a rusty machete, a clenched fist, making decisions on the spot, trusting in the animal instinct awakened by terror. The battle ceased to be coordinated. It became instinctive, primitive, a frenzy of survival where man was reduced to bone and blood. And yet, no one retreated. Because retreating meant making space, and making space meant certain death. It meant handing Kholm over piece by piece to the enemy who was already devouring its entrails. Kholm was no longer a city. It was a fragmented battlefield, where every house was a living trench, every corridor a bloody front line, and every step could be the last, echoing like the bell of a funeral that no one would hear. The war had drawn so close, so near, that escape was now impossible. It was within the walls, seeping into the cracks like a poisonous gas, within the snow, which absorbed blood and secrets, within the men, who carried terror in their eyes like a wound that would never heal. And at the bottom of that abyss of bricks and bones, despair grew like a shadow that swallowed even the last spark of hope. The city in ruins. As the days passed, or were they weeks, time dissolved into ice and fire. Kholm ceased to be a city. It was slowly undone, piece by piece, like a living body being skinned alive by invisible hands. What were once modest houses with smoking chimneys, paved streets where children played in the distant summer, churches with towers pointing to a now indifferent sky, were now transformed into a pile of frozen rubble, a cemetery of stone and wood where nothing breathed anymore. The artillery gave no respite, a divine hammer of Soviet fury that fell mercilessly. With each new bombardment, what little remained standing crumbled in a roar that made the ground tremble as if the earth itself were agonizing. Roofs disappeared in clouds of dust and snow. Walls cracked with groans of ancient pain and collapsed in cascades. Entire structures simply ceased to exist, reduced to dust carried by the wind like ashes from an endless funeral. The landscape was constantly shifting, treacherous as a fever dream. A building that offered shelter in the morning, thick walls against the wind, a dark corner to close one's eyes for a moment, could become a pile of rubble by afternoon, burying alive those who dared to trust it. A street that seemed passable, with trails carved into the snow by weary boots, would become, in minutes, a field of deep craters, filled with dirty snow and ice as sharp as knives. The terrain was no longer reliable. It was unstable, treacherous, deadly, a labyrinth where each step could cause the ground to give way, swallowing a man whole into a tomb of rubble and darkness. The cold sealed everything, transforming ruins into grotesque sculptures of ice and twisted iron. The town church, which once stood as a symbol of normalcy, of faith that had once warmed hearts on long nights, was repeatedly struck, as if God himself had been shot. Its thick walls resisted for a time, echoing the thunder of the bombs like a broken organ, but finally gave way in a final gasp of masonry. What remained was a mutilated, skeletal structure, now used as an observation point and makeshift shelter by men who no longer believed in anything sacred. Nothing there was sacred anymore. Everything had been swallowed by the war, desecrated, reduced to rubble that served only to pile up bodies or block gunfire. The men fought amidst the remnants of what was once civilian life, a cruel irony that tore at the soul. Destroyed furniture, splintered wooden chairs, tables overturned like pathetic barricades, pieces of doors that once guarded family secrets, broken beams that supported roofs of dreams now served as protection against bullets or shrapnel. Each fragment was reused with manic desperation. A torn mattress to cushion the impact of grenades, a wall crucifix transformed into a lever to open holes in the walls. It was a constant, desperate adaptation, where creativity was born from pure panic, from the instinct not to die yet. But the destruction wasn't just physical, palpable, visible in the piles of bricks, bleeding red mortar. It was psychological, a slow corrosion that devoured the mind from within. With each explosion that shook the foundations, the feeling of security disappeared even further. Like sand slipping through frozen fingers, there was no truly safe place. Makeshift shelters could collapse in an instant, burying alive those who hid there. Walls could be pierced by hot shrapnel that tore flesh like paper. Danger came from all sides, from above, with bombs falling from the gray sky, from the flanks, with silent infiltrations, from the ground itself, which trembled and gave way. The sound was constant, an auditory hell that never ceased. Explosions that cracked skulls, gunshots that cut through the air like whips, screams of men who saw death in their eyes, the dry impact of structures giving way like bones breaking. Even in the rare moments of silence, those that lasted seconds and seemed like eternities, the echo of destruction lingered in the soldiers' minds, hammering like a funeral bell. It was impossible to relax. The body might stop, exhausted to the core, but the mind remained on a high alert, eyes wide in the darkness, ears picking up every creak, every whisper of the wind that could be the footsteps of an enemy. And amidst that devastated landscape, the Red Army continued to press on, relentless as the very hunger that drove them. With the city reduced to ruins, the Soviets found even more opportunities for infiltration. Like hungry rats in a sinking ship, the rubble offered natural cover. Craters became stealthy advance routes. Holes in the walls allowed unexpected movements that caught the defenders by surprise. The destroyed terrain favored close combat, precisely where the brutality was greatest, where the terror became intimate, personal, inescapable. For the defenders, this meant only one thing. The battle was becoming harder by the hour, more suffocating, more hopeless. There were no more clear lines of defense. Everything was fragmented, scattered, like a broken mirror reflecting 1,000 deaths. What remained was a series of isolated positions, connected only by the fragile determination of the men who still resisted, a determination that cracked with each comrade who fell without a sound. The bodies began to accumulate obscenely, mercilessly. Many could not be removed. There was no time, no strength. They remained there, frozen in the same place where they had fallen, mixed with the dirty snow and rubble, glazed, eyes staring into nothingness. The cold preserved everything with surgical cruelty, creating a static landscape of death. Bluish faces, hands clenched into eternal fists, uniforms hardened like ice armor. It was impossible to ignore. Each step reminded them of the price being paid. Each breath carried the smell of slow decomposition under the ice. The smell of war also changed, permeating everything like a curse. Even with the intense cold that burned the lungs, there was a constant odor of burnt gunpowder, acrid smoke from charred wood, and damp destruction. It was a smell that seeped into clothes, skin, pores, and deepest memories. A smell that none of the survivors would forget, even if they lived 1,000 years. The stench of partially decomposing bodies, of frozen blood mixed with churned earth, of fear exhaled in icy sweat. Kholm was no longer recognizable. There was no longer any distinction between street and battlefield, between house and grave, between living and dead. Everything was battlefield. Everything was ruin. Everything was despair. And in the midst of that destroyed scene, where the wind carried brick dust like confetti at a funeral, the men continued to fight, not for grand victory, not for glorious advance, but simply to stay alive for another day, for another hour, for another breath that ached like swallowed glass. The city had been reduced to ruins, a skeleton of stone and bones where the echo of gunfire sounded like the last gasp of a world. Crumbling, but the battle was far from over. It dragged on, eternally, within the bowels of the dead city, fueled by the fear that never slept, by the hopelessness that devoured souls, and by the terror that transformed men into shadows of themselves. The net is closing in. While the siege initially seemed like a distant threat, now it was becoming suffocating. With each passing day, the space inside Kholm diminished. The German positions, once scattered throughout the city, began to shrink. Under the constant pressure of the Red Army, isolated points were attacked, surrounded, and when they could no longer be held, they simply disappeared from the map. There were not enough reinforcements to recover lost ground. Every abandoned meter was lost forever, and every meter lost made the next one even harder to defend. The Soviets advanced methodically. It wasn't a disorganized attack. It was a calculated, slow but relentless onslaught. First came the artillery, crushing specific positions. Then the infantry advanced, consolidating the conquered ground. Next, new positions were fortified, preventing any effective counterattack. It was like watching a knot being tightened more and more. Inside the pocket, the feeling of space disappeared. The soldiers were forced to retreat from destroyed sectors, concentrating in smaller, denser, more vulnerable areas. Makeshift shelters were now overcrowded. Lines of defense overlapped. The risk of friendly fire increased. Confusion became part of the routine, and with less space came more danger. The enemy attacks were arriving faster. The distance between the two sides was minimal. In some places, they were separated only by a narrow street, a pile of rubble, or a partially destroyed wall. Sometimes, it was possible to hear the enemy talking, moving, waiting. War no longer knew any distance. It was constant. It was nearby. It was personal. Resources were dwindling at an alarming rate. Ammunition needed to be rationed, even more strictly. Every shot was carefully considered. Every burst of machine gun fire was measured. There was no room for waste. Food was also becoming scarce. Rations were reduced. Men shared minuscule portions, trying to conserve enough energy to keep fighting. Hunger was becoming as dangerous an enemy as the cold. Bodies weakened. Reflexes slowed. Physical stamina began to fail. And then there were the wounded. With the siege closing in, evacuating the seriously wounded became nearly impossible. They crowded into makeshift shelters, many without adequate treatment. Low groans filled the silence between battles. Doctors did the impossible with almost nothing, improvising, deciding who still had a chance and who didn't. It was a cruel choice, but inevitable. The psychological pressure was reaching new levels. There was no longer any illusion of control. The soldiers knew they were being slowly squeezed, with no room to breathe, no margin for error. Each day seemed heavier than the last, each night longer, and yet no one backed down completely, because there was nowhere to retreat to. Kholm had become a small nucleus of resistance, surrounded on all sides, constantly under pressure, a dwindling point, but still alive. Outside, the Red Army maintained complete control of the siege. They knew time was on their side. They didn't need to take unnecessary risks. They just had to keep pressing, keep tightening their grip, until there was nothing left. Within the city, the reality was clear to everyone. They were being slowly crushed. No escape, no immediate relief, just resistance. And with each passing hour, the unspoken question grew heavier. How much longer could they hold out? Heaven as our last hope. When all land routes disappeared, only one possible direction remained: the sky. With Kholm completely surrounded and squeezed under the constant pressure of the Red Army, the German command made a risky decision to resupply the city by air. It was a desperate operation, full of variables beyond their control, but it was the only chance to keep the men alive and fighting. The responsibility fell on the Luftwaffe, and the challenge was brutal. The pilots had to fly over completely hostile territory, facing not only enemy fire, but also the true invisible enemy: winter, sudden blizzards, violent winds, near zero visibility. The sky, as well as the ground, had become a battlefield. Still, they flew. On each mission, aircraft loaded with ammunition, food, medicine, and fuel attempted to reach Kholm. There were no adequate runways. There was no security. Often, supplies were simply dropped from the air, in improvised parachutes or even thrown directly, in the hope that they would fall on territory still controlled by the defenders. But it didn't always work. Many shipments fell outside the perimeter, straight into Soviet hands. Others were lost in the snow, difficult to locate amidst the chaos and craters. Some simply disappeared, swallowed by the weather or destroyed before even arriving. And then there were the losses. Soviet anti-aircraft artillery was on high alert. Shots rose from the ground, attempting to hit the aircraft. Enemy fighters also posed a constant threat. Several planes did not return. Some were last seen disappearing into dense clouds. Others crashed in flames, leaving dark trails in the white sky. Each mission was a calculated risk, and often a fatal one. Inside Kholm, the soldiers waited anxiously. The sound of engines in the sky became something almost sacred. When they heard that distant noise, Everyone looked up. It was a sign of hope, a reminder that they had not yet been completely forgotten. When the supplies arrived, it was a race. Men would leave their positions, risking enemy fire, to retrieve fallen crates. Sometimes they had to dig through deep snow to find what had been thrown. Each crate was opened urgently, almost desperately. Inside them, there was life. Ammunition meant continuing the fight. Food meant another day of resistance. Medication represented a chance to save someone who would otherwise be lost. But it was never enough. Deliveries were irregular and unpredictable. What arrived didn't cover all the needs. Commanders were forced to decide how to distribute resources. Who would receive more? Who would have to survive with less? It was cruel mathematics. Meanwhile, the pilots continued flying, mission after mission, knowing that they might not return, knowing that each flight was a fine line between success and death. The sky had become the last link between Kholm and the outside world, the last hope, but it was a fragile hope, dependent on conditions that no one could control. Inside the besieged city, the men quickly learned, not every airplane sound meant salvation, but when it meant something, it made all the difference between living and disappearing in that frozen hell. Hunger, disease, and despair. As the weeks passed, a new enemy began to dominate. Kholm, silent, ruthless, inevitable. Hunger. At first, there was still some control. Rations were reduced, carefully distributed. Each man received small portions. Stale bread, canned goods, leftover provisions that had been brought before the siege was fully closed. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep fighting, for a while. But time passed, and the stock ran out. The Luftwaffe's deliveries couldn't keep up with the need. What arrived was insufficient, irregular, often lost before it could even be recovered. And so within the besieged city, reality began to change drastically. The men began to feel it. First, the constant emptiness in the stomach, then the weakness. Movements became slower, heavier, energy vanished. Every action, getting up, running, throwing, required an ever-increasing effort. The body was beginning to fail, but hunger didn't come alone. With her came the illnesses. Without proper nutrition, hygiene, or sufficient medical care, the soldiers' bodies became vulnerable. Infections spread rapidly. Minor injuries turned into serious problems. Gangrene, already common due to the cold, became even more frequent. The makeshift shelters, filled with frail men, became breeding grounds for disease. The air was heavy. The smell was hard to ignore. Doctors did what they could, but it was almost nothing. There was a shortage of medicine, a shortage of instruments, a shortage of time. Many of the wounded and sick were simply kept alive as long as possible, with no real hope of recovery. Some were left in silence, covered with whatever was available, while the war continued all around. And then came despair. The soldiers began searching for anything that could be consumed. Forgotten leftovers, frozen food found among the rubble. In some cases, even things that would have been unthinkable before. Survival did not allow for luxuries. She demanded difficult decisions, and each decision exacted a psychological price. Morale plummeted slowly, not all at once, but like a steady decline, day after day. Physical exhaustion mingled with mental weariness. Some men became silent, introspective. Others showed irritation, tension, pent-up outbursts of anger. But above all, there was resistance. Even weakened, even hungry, they continued fighting, because they knew that stopping meant dying. Outside, the Red Army maintained constant pressure. Attacks continued. The siege did not loosen. There was no truce. There was no mercy. The enemy did not need to hasten the end. It knew that time was playing its part. Inside Kholm, the fight was no longer just against bullets or explosions. It was against his own body, against weakness, against the growing urge to simply give up. And yet, no one surrendered. Because in that frozen hell, resistance was not just an order. It was the only thing left, the psychological burden of siege. As the days passed, which already seemed like weeks, And the weeks, which seemed like months, something began to break inside the men in Kholm. It wasn't the body, it was in mind. The siege didn't just apply pressure with weapons, cold or hunger. It pressed from within, silently, constantly, without rest. The routine of war has ceased to exist. There were no more clear days or peaceful nights. Everything blended into a repetitive cycle of tension, alertness, and exhaustion. The soldiers no longer knew for sure what day it was. Time lost its meaning. The only clock that mattered was the sound of the attacks and the rare moments of silence between them. And the silence. That was perhaps the worst part, because silence in Kholm never meant peace. It meant waiting. Wait for the next bombing, for the next attack, for the next moment everything would explode again. The men lived in a constant state of alert. Even when they tried to rest, their bodies didn't fully relax. Any sound, a crackling of wood, the wind passing through ruins, a footstep in the snow, was enough to trigger their survival instinct. Sleeping has become a risk. Many avoided closing their eyes for long periods. Others simply couldn't. And those who did sleep often woke up panicked, confused, feeling like they were under attack, even when they weren't. The mind could no longer distinguish reality from fear. Some soldiers began to shut down completely. They would remain silent for long periods, staring into space, as if trying to disconnect from it all. Others reacted in the opposite way. Constant irritation, aggressive responses, outbursts of pent-up tension. It was psychological exhaustion taking shape. Loneliness also weighed heavily. Even surrounded by other men, many felt isolated. There was no communication with the outside world beyond the few messages that arrived. There was no clear news. There was no certainty of rescue. Only doubts, and more doubts. They began to wonder, how long will this last? Does anyone even know we're here anymore? Is it worth continuing? And these questions had no answer. The fear of death was always present, but it wasn't an immediate fear. It was something deeper, more constant. It wasn't the fear of dying at that instant. It was the fear of disappearing there, slowly, without anyone ever knowing exactly how it happened. The Red Army remained outside, invisible at many times, but always present. This constant presence, even when there was no attack, increased the pressure even more. It was like living with an enemy that never slept, never retreated, never disappeared. Some soldiers began to develop a kind of apathy, not for lack of courage, but for an excess of everything. Excessive fear, excessive pain, excessive tiredness. It was as if the mind, in order to survive, began to shut down certain parts. But even so, they continued, because there was something stronger than fear, stronger than exhaustion, stronger than despair. The need to survive another day, another night, another attack. And so, within that suffocating siege, the most silent battle of all was taking place, not in the streets, not in the ruins, but within the mind of every man who still stood. And that was a battle that nobody could see, but everyone was fighting, attempts to break the siege. While inside Kholm, the men struggled to survive each day. Outside, another battle raged, less visible, but equally brutal, the attempt to reach the besieged city. The German command knew they couldn't let Kholm fall easily. That position, though small on the map, still represented an important point of resistance amidst the Soviet advance. And more than that, thousands of men were trapped there, men who were still fighting, men who were still waiting. And so, the rescue operations began. German units positioned outside the encirclement were given the mission to advance toward the city. It was no simple attack. It was a race against time, against the terrain, and against an enemy that was already prepared. The Red Army not only surrounded Kholm, it defended the Bayi siege with fierce determination. Soviet forces had established deep defensive positions around the city, trenches, well-defined firing ranges, strategically positioned artillery. Any attempt to advance was immediately detected and met with force. The first German moves were cautious. Patrols advanced to test the terrain. Small units attempted to break through, exploiting potential weaknesses in the Soviet lines. But it quickly became clear there would be no easy path. Every advance was paid for with blood. The German troops faced the same enemy as the men inside Kholm: the extreme cold, the frozen terrain, the limited visibility. But, in addition, they had to break through well-organized lines, defended by an enemy who knew exactly what was at stake. The fighting was intense. Artillery exchanged constant fire. Infantry advanced under bursts of machine gun fire. Explosions cut through the silence of the snow-covered forests. Every meter gained required extreme effort and was often lost soon after. It was a battle of attrition, slow, tiresome, mortal. Inside Kholm, rumors began to circulate. Some soldiers said they heard distant fighting, muffled sounds of artillery coming from outside the encirclement. Others believed they were just echoes, illusions created by a weary mind. But the idea that someone was trying to reach them began to rekindle a flame. Small, fragile, but present. Hope. The officers tried to stay focused. They couldn't rely on something uncertain. The order remained the same: resist. But deep down, even they knew that those external attempts were their only real chance of long-term survival. The days went by, and progress remained slow. The terrain made everything difficult. The deep snow slowed movements. Equipment malfunctioned. Supply lines were stretched to their limit, and the Soviets did not retreat easily. Every position was defended with determination. Every retreat was calculated. There was no collapse, just resistance from both sides. For every small German gain, there was a high cost. Men fell, wounded piled up, units quickly became depleted. Still, the pressure continued. They advanced because they had to, because stopping meant abandoning Kholm, and abandoning Kholm was not an acceptable option. Inside the city, the men continued fighting, not knowing when or if that external effort would reach them. But now there was something different in the air, something beyond fear, something beyond despair. The possibility that somewhere beyond the siege, someone was still fighting for them. And that possibility was enough to keep resisting. The bloody rescue. After weeks that felt like an eternity, something began to change. At first it was just a sound, distant, stifled by wind and snow, but different. Inside Kholm, some soldiers raised their heads. They paused for a moment, ignoring the cold, ignoring the extreme fatigue. This was no ordinary Soviet artillery. The pattern was different. The rhythm different. It was a fight coming from outside. And this time, it wasn't my imagination. After slow and extremely costly advances, the German forces were finally approaching the encirclement. It was not a clean advance, nor an organized one like in the early days of the war. It was a desperate push, made by exhausted and wounded men, but determined to break through that barrier at any cost. Outside, the Red Army resisted with everything it had. They knew exactly what was happening. If the siege were broken, even partially, the entire effort of weeks could be compromised. So they fought with brutal intensity. Artillery was concentrated on the advance routes. Machine guns were positioned to block any attempt to advance. Every meter was defended as if it were the last. And yet, the Germans advanced. Slowly, paying for every step with blood. Violent fighting erupted on the outer lines of the siege. Grenades, gunfire, explosions, all happening amidst deep snow and biting cold. Men fell, but others immediately took their place. There was no pause, no meaningful retreat. It was constant pressure, ruthless. Inside Kholm, the perception was becoming increasingly clear. They were no longer alone. The sound of the battle outside grew louder. At times, it seemed close enough to touch. This changed everything. Soldiers who had previously fought only for survival now felt something different, a renewed urgency. It was time. If there was a chance, it was now. The forces within. The pocket began to intensify their own actions. Small counterattacks were launched. Positions were defended with even greater ferocity. The idea was simple. Press from within, while the advance came from without, to create a rupture. And then, finally, it happened. After fierce fighting and heavy losses, a connection was established. It wasn't a wide, safe, or stable corridor. It was narrow, fragile, constantly threatened by enemy fire. But it was real. The siege had been partially broken. Contact was made. For many soldiers inside Kholm, that moment was almost unbelievable. Men who had spent weeks surrounded, isolated, on the verge of collapse, now saw other soldiers arriving, different faces, new voices, concrete proof that they had not been abandoned. But the price was high, very high. The fighting that led to that breakaway left a trail of destruction. Bodies scattered in the snow, destroyed equipment, units reduced to fractions of what they once were. Both those who came from outside and those who resisted from within had been deeply scarred. And even with the corridor open, the danger was not over. The Red Army continued to press on. Attempts to close the encirclement again were constant. The corridor needed to be kept under continuous combat. It was not a safe route. It was a lifeline held by force. But still, it was enough. Supplies began to flow more consistently. The wounded could be evacuated. The immediate pressure eased, albeit slightly. For the first time in a long time, there was something concrete beyond daily survival. There was a real chance of continuing. The rescue was not clean. It wasn't quick. It wasn't heroic in the classical sense. It was brutal, bloody, painful, but it was real. And for those who were still alive inside Kholm, that made all the difference between disappearing into the ice or continuing to fight. Survivors of a frozen hell. When the worst finally passed, or at least ceased to be constant, what remained of Kholm could no longer be called a city. It was a frozen cemetery. The silence that now hung over the ruins was not peace. It was a consequence of weeks of uninterrupted combat, of hunger, of extreme cold, and of psychological pressure that few human beings could withstand. The men who left that place were no longer the same men who had entered. Of the approximately 5,500 who had been surrounded, many were left behind, killed in combat, frozen during the night, consumed by wounds, disease, or exhaustion. Their bodies, in many cases, remained where they fell, preserved by the cold, like silent witnesses to what had happened there. The survivors carried more than just visible scars. Some limped. Others had lost fingers, hands, parts of their faces, war wounds that would never disappear. But there was also what could not be seen, the psychological weight, the memories, the sounds that would continue to echo long after it was all over. The sound of artillery, the screams in the dark, the heavy silence between attacks. This didn't go away. It never disappeared. Many of those men were evacuated from Kholm through the corridor that had been opened with such difficulty. Others remained on the front lines, still fighting, still resisting, because the war was far from over. The Eastern Front continued to burn, and Kholm was just one of the many points of suffering scattered across that vast expanse. But what happened there was different. Kholm became a symbol, not a clean victory, not a decisive strategic conquest, but extremely resilient, of men pushed to their absolute limits, both physically and mentally, and who, even then, continued fighting. Outside, the Red Army continued advancing on other fronts. The war raged on, relentlessly, without pause. For them, Kholm was just another chapter in a much larger offensive. But for those who were inside, Kholm was everything. It was the cold that almost killed them. Hunger weakened them. Constant fear. The daily struggle to survive a few more hours. And above all, it was proof of how far a human being can go when there is no other choice. Some survived to tell the tale. Others didn't have that chance. But they were all part of something that would be remembered forever. Because Kholm was not just a battle. It was a brutal test of human endurance. A place where winter, war, and despair collided, creating one of the most extreme scenarios of all of World War II. And even after the HEK shooting stopped, The echo of that frozen hell continued to live on in the memory of those who came out of there, and in history, as a permanent reminder of the price of war. Kholm was not a battle that changed the course of the war. He did not decide the fate of nations. He didn't go down in history for his great maps or his crushing victories. But what happened there was something deeper, more human, more brutal. In that frozen patch of the Eastern Front, surrounded by the Red Army, ordinary men were pushed beyond all known limits. They fought not only against an armed enemy, but against the silently killing cold, against the hunger that consumed them from within, and against the constant fear of disappearing without a trace. Kholm wasn't about progress. It was about resisting. To resist when everything told you to stop. To resist when the body no longer responds. To resist when the mind began to break down. Every destroyed street, every ruined house, every body frozen in the snow tells a story that cannot be ignored. A story of extreme suffering, of silent courage, and of a type of war that leaves no room for perfect heroes, only survivors. And perhaps that is precisely why Kholm should never be forgotten, because it shows us war without masks, without glory, no illusions, just the raw reality of men fighting to the very limit of what it means to be alive. And when silence finally fell over that ice-covered field, what remained was not victory, not even defeat. It was a memory, a cold, heavy, and eternal memory.